Okay, thank you. So today I will give a talk about the growth of longitudinal social network analysis. Very recently there was a chapter published in a book edited by Wayne Osgood and Mark Feinberg, and there was a book dedicated to the Prosper data set, and this chapter is one of the concluding chapters of that book. So throughout the book, about 15 people, including Jim Moody and Wayne Osgood himself and Derek Krieger, a good friend, they all contributed to that book using the Prosper data, and then I and Tom Valenti were asked to reflect on the data set. And what I tell you today, well, is more or less based on that chapter. But first of all, thanks for inviting me. It was about half a year ago, I think, that Diego asked me whether I would be willing to come to Chile. I immediately said yes. It was also easy to say yes because my two children are now grown up. So in former years I would have said no. Definitely the year before, because my youngest son was in his graduation year, in his examination year, and he needed his father. So it was a relief that he passed all the exams. But this year we could easily go, and it was a warm welcome about a month ago. Since then we hiked. I even sat on a horse, and we did kayaking and canoeing. It's absolutely amazing. We went all the way south to Tierra del Fuego, and the food is also super good here. So at the Isle of Chiloé, I was hoping to get cuaranto, but I learned that there was not only seafood in it, but also sausages and chicken. And for that reason, I didn't take it. But see how much food this person from San Francisco named Ted got. It was amazing. It was only the lunch. So it was really good to be here, and I'm looking forward to this workshop, and I will stay the whole week. So if you want to chat, I'm here. If you want to consult me during the group work, I'm around. So what is the setup for this next 60 minutes? There are 5 things that I want to speak about. Well, more or less the growth in social network research in schools. So there is much more social networks research. I'm a sociologist, so in my department many others study it in organizations, for example, or look at criminal networks. But for today I focus on schools, on children, on adolescents. I say something about the state of the art on the research on selection and influence, and then I focus on avenues for further research. So the types of influence, types of complexity, and I will end with social network interventions. So I do not know all of you yet, but I can imagine that many of you already have collected social network data but never realized that it was really social network data. So I already told you about the book about Prosper. And the funny thing is that Prosper was an intervention study, and Mark Feinberg at some moment had the brilliant idea to add only one question: who are your best friends, to the data collection. And they did that every 8 waves. They did that with paper and pencil, so they had those list with names that people could put the first name and the first letter of the last name on, and they stored it for years, and then at some moment they put it into the computer. But based on that one item, that they have published, I think, about 60 articles. So it's amazing what one item can do. for me it was more or less a bit the same story. So besides that, my research is very much focused on social networks. I do also a lot of research on bullying, and people often ask me, why do you study bullying? Were you a victim yourself in the past? But the short answer is no. When I was involved in the TRAILS study, I was asked to come up with a couple of social network items, and I asked around. I was not a social network researcher at that time, and people said to me, you should ask about friendships, about negative relationships, dislike, and maybe you can also and then I was thinking, but maybe in that same way I can also ask about a positive relation in the classroom. So I asked all the TRAILS respondents, by whom are you helped and who do you help yourself? And I did the same for bullying. By whom are you bullied and who do you bully? And I hadn't realized that that was very novel. And the whole theory about bullying research was about the group process, but people never measured the relationships. They always focused on what are the characteristics of the bully or what are the characteristics of the victim. And through these questions we could really map the network. And this type of research is often used in, well, in a traditional way, in the sense that people want to know who are the best friends or who dislikes whom, but they are not really interested in the dyadic relationship. No, they want to aggregate these data and then come up with the reputation. So if you have a classroom, let's think of 25 children, and some boys or girls are mentioned 15 times as a best friend out of 24 classmates. Well, that is enormous, isn't it? So these kids are then seen as pretty nice and pretty likable. If you are mentioned 10 times as disliked, well, that is really a high score. Then you are really seen as someone, well, that others dislike, that they reject. So that is what people used to do until, let's say, 20 years ago, that they calculated the peer reputations on the basis of these questions. But of course you can do much more about that, and there is this whole week about we can map the social network. Well, here you see an example of a social network that I have used in my presentations very often. It's a very simple question: who bullies you? It's a classroom with 19 students. These kids are quite young. They are about 10, 11. It's in the Netherlands common that classrooms are mixed. So in gray you see the boys, in black you see the girls. And it turns out that in this classroom there are 3 people here at the right that are very often mentioned as the bully. So all the arrows go in those directions. Well, if you want to know more about that, you can go to my website, and most of the papers will be downloadable directly or indirectly, for example, for ResearchGate, or you can email me. But for today I will focus on my research on social networks. The good news for all of you who are relatively new to this field or are exploring whether this is the way to go is that social network research is still a field where at some moment you may be able to say, well, I have read more or less everything. So think about that from, for other topics, for example bullying. Well, I would not be surprised if the number of studies on bullying is nowadays something like 3,000 a year. I have no idea what the exact number is. It can be 2,000 more, it can be 1,000 less, but it's so much that I do not consider myself to be an expert on all aspects of bullying. Certainly not. only on the group process of bullying. But with social network research, you really can read everything. So if you see how many papers were written in the, let's say, the last 20 years, then it's nowadays probably around 300 in which children and adolescents are involved. And of course, if you are new to the field, 300 is a lot, and I would not recommend you to read everything before you start doing your research. But of course, you may be interested in the relationship between friendships and, for example, substance use or depression or another topic, and that will reduce the number of papers that you have to read enormously. But it's nice to see that that if you jump on this train, then that it is relatively a new field. And here you have an overview of some of the most used data sets. And well, it's nice to see that the field has really grown. There's one enormous outlier, that's the EdHealth study that was one of the very first studies that included social network questions. It's certainly not the best study. By now it's quite outdated. It's 30 years old. So all the papers that are written nowadays on EdHealth and are, for example, dealing with smoking, well, it was really at a time that smoking was pretty cool. Nowadays that has changed in most countries worldwide quite a lot. So in many other aspects, these data are quite outdated. But there are many other studies, luckily. Personally, I was involved in a couple of them. The SNARE data set, the KiVa data set, Diego already mentioned it, and also the Arnhem School study. What you also can see, if you go through all these acronyms, and of course you do not know what all these acronyms exactly stand for, but I can tell you most of these studies are done in Western countries. So there's only one study from South Korea. That is the exception. All the others are from or the US or Europe. Another thing that I want to share with you is that most studies are done in the window between, let's say, 10 and 16. So, for example, EdHealth started at the age of 12 till the age of 18. But at the same time, EdHealth only had 2 waves of data collection with network data, as far as I remember. And I'm not sure, it will be on the next slide, but only something like 1.5 years in between. So SNARE data was also in secondary education. Prosper was also mainly in middle school, high school. And I didn't realize it until I made this slide, but with the KiVa now we have by far the youngest sample. I know that there are some other studies with even younger samples. So it is possible, if you are interested in the networks of toddlers or preschoolers, to collect network data. There are some people that do that, like Jennifer Watling-Neal. But it's usually very small scale. Most of these samples are, well, let's say 4 groups with preschoolers and a sample of, let's say, 60 people. But it has been done. What you also can see is that most studies end at the age of 18. A good exception is the Swiss Student Life study by Christoph Stadtveld. And, well, if we see this, that the dominant time window is between, let's say, 10 and 16, or 12 and 16, that maybe we should collect data earlier on and also later on, because it's not sure that network processes are always the same in the different age periods. Well, this is pretty small to read, but it is in the chapter. And what you see here, for example, is not only the name of the data set, the country, but also the setting in which the network questions were done. And you see some variation here. So some studies collect data only among classmates. So then you see the C. And very often that is done in primary school. So here, for example, the Arnhem School Study, primary school study in the Netherlands. In primary school, the classroom is stable and, well, represents most of the friendships that children have. Some studies combine it. So, for example, in the KiVa study, also done in the Netherlands, we collected most of the network questions within the classroom, but for some of the questions it was possible to also nominate others from other classrooms. And that is relevant because in the Netherlands some schools have several classes in the same grade. So these schools are so large that they have multiple grades, 6 for example. And what is even more important, in the Netherlands very often you have multiple grade classrooms. So you have mixed grade classrooms. You have often combinations of, let's say, grade 3 and 4 or 5 and 6. And it may very well be that the children in grade 4 were classmates of other children in grade 4 in some years before, or will be in future years. So we were glad that we also asked about these relationships between classes, because for some of the analysis we really had to focus on the whole school, because in that way it was much easier to follow these kids longitudinally. In secondary education you often see that people focus on the grade. And there is one study done in Sweden, the 10 to 18 study, and they focused on the whole town. So everyone between 10 and 18 was included in the study. There was about 1,000 adolescents. And that town was so isolated that the next school was in every direction was at least 20 kilometers away. So everyone from that area went to that school, and in that sense they had the complete network of teenagers. What more can you see here? For example, if you are dreaming of a new data collection, some of the sample sizes are enormous, like Prosper with 14,000 students, KiVa with 10,000 students. But you also see that there are many studies around 1,000 respondents. And here you see the recency of the studies. And for example, that study from South Korea is about 700 students, and another recent study, where is it? Well, anyway, it's not always the case that that you need, well, so many respondents. It also depends, of course, on your research question. In terms of power, it's good to realize that on this on the part where you look at selection, who is friends with whom, you have a lot of power. Because if you have a classroom with 25 people, you have 24 times 25 relationships. So there you have a lot of power, and you do not need these large samples. For influence it's a different story, because there you only have 25 people. But it becomes more complicated, and I will come back to that later in this presentation if you also want to include some contextual effects, like social norms, for example, and then the unit of analysis becomes the classroom, and then you need these large samples. Well, finally, we also included the number of waves and the intervals, and you see that some studies that have been used quite often have quite a lot of measurement points. So KiVa has 5, Prof has 8, SNARE has 6 or more, depends on which sample in SNARE. Personally, I think that about every 4 months, every 6 months is ideal. Depends, of course, again on your question. But most behaviors and attitudes do not change from month to month. So if you come back every half a year, there will be the chance that there is variation is much higher, and not so much that everything has completely changed. But most data sets come back to these respondents at least on a yearly basis. So here is no example of a study where it's more than 12 months. So for EdHealth it was 12 months. I didn't know it before, but now I can see it. It is 12 months. Okay, this was just the start to give you an idea of social network research, that it is a domain where it's still possible to pick up with everything that has been done. And I already identified some gaps in literature. We do not know so much about college students or young adults. We do not know that much about young children. Let's continue with the second part. We often come to the conclusion that people are similar in all kinds of aspects. And what is the reason that people are quite similar? For example, if you are quite similar, then it's much more likely that you have a good communication with that person, that you have a good conversation, that you communicate with less effort. It may also lead to a shared sense of belonging. For teenagers, it may also strengthen their social identity. If you think about similarity and that people are similar, for example, in their drinking behavior, or that they're similar in their prosocial behavior, or that they are similar in their academic achievement, well, then the question is, why are people similar? And there are two reasons for that. One is selection, and the other is influence. And there are also two sayings for that. So for selection, we have the saying, birds of a feather flock together. So it may very well be that if you are teaching at the university and you see a group of, let's say, 19-year-olds, that you have some smokers in your class, and that these smokers are friends with each other. But did they influence each other? Well, very unlikely, because they all came from different high schools, and by the time that they came to the university, some were addicted and others were not at all attracted to smoking. So they selected each other, and they found each other because, well, I'm not sure how it is here in Chile, but in the Netherlands we have smoking designated areas, and well, when I was a student, it was still allowed to smoke inside the buildings, and when I was a student assistant, I had to work in an office of a professor who smoked in her office. But luckily times have changed. But nowadays, for example, it's super hard for students. They have to be in a good condition to smoke in the Netherlands, because if I teach, then and there's a break of 15 minutes, well, they need more or less 7 minutes to go off campus and smoke, and then 7 minutes to return. So they almost have to run to for one cigarette. So in that sense, it's pretty likely, if that is the situation, that you are always going to that smoking designated area, that you will meet there every day at the same time, the same others, and that you will start to have a conversation, and that eventually you become friends. But did they influence each other? No. They selected each other on the basis of the same type of behavior. That's selection. I hope that is clear. The alternative is influence, and there's also a saying for that: one rotten apple spoils the barrel. So that is really about influence. So your friends, your peers have a certain type of behavior, and you adopt that behavior, so you change in, well, how you behave, or you change your opinions, or other things. And the great news is that in my hometown, Groningen, also the place where Jago did his PhD dissertation, Tom Snijders developed, well, in the last 30 years, the Shannon model. So when I was a PhD student, I worked with Tom Snijders, but on multi-level analysis. But there were already other PhD students that were working with Tom on social network analysis. And the nice thing is that this program called Shannon is able to disentangle selection from influence. And well, that is definitely something that you will use in this week. I think in my field of research on children and adolescents, this paper was really a game changer. It came out in 2013. It was the introduction to a special issue, but not the kind of introduction that only summarized all of the papers. No, it was really the state of the art at that time in 2013. And this group of people were also the editors of that special issue, and we invited I think 16 groups of authors to contribute to the special issue. So I think until 2013, if you wrote a paper using longitudinal social network analysis, you always had to defend yourself that you were doing it, and reviewers were often asking about alternative ways to analyze your data because they didn't understand the method, and they wanted you to tell what the explained variance is, or other things that the effect sizes, all the things that they were familiar with using other methods. But after 2013, after this publication of this special issue, people had to defend if they didn't use it, if they were interested in peer influence. So in that sense, the field has definitely changed. So what do we know about different topics? Just a very brief overview. Well, for example, if it comes down to externalizing behavior, many of the early studies using social network analysis were on externalizing behavior. Then we learned that people often select each other on the basis of delinquency, but not so much on the basis of aggression. So many studies show that aggressive kids also prefer to be friends with non-aggressive kids. Social network analysis is about selection and influence. There is influence on aggression and delinquency. So if you are friends with kids who are high on delinquency or high on aggression, it's more likely that you will also develop such behavior. But there are also other things that you can do with social network analysis, and that is something that I also want to point out. For example, you can also look at who in the network are more likely to be selected as a friend. So you can look at the alter effect, and then you will see that delinquent kids often get a lot of nominations. So others somehow like them. Maybe it's also for safety, but maybe it's also because there's always something going on if you hang around with them. So they are not dull. They are maybe not nice, but they are certainly not dull. So they have a quite high status. There are also indications, for example, that the ego effect of delinquency is usually negative, which means that these kids are not nominating that many others if you compare it with other classmates. So they are quite selective in who they befriend from their perspective. And the last thing that I want to mention here is that I already told you about, well, some studies focus on the classroom, others on the grade, others on the school, or even the town. But for looking at delinquency, the 10 to 18 study in Sweden showed that the larger the network became, the stronger the effect of friends' externalizing behavior. So the message of that study was that if you focus only on the classroom, it might be that you miss the ones in the larger peer network that are really influential if it comes down to delinquency. So if only the class, then that are the relationships that are focused on learning. But if you also include the grade or the whole school, then you start also to include others from other classes that they meet maybe after school, in the weekend, dropouts, etc., etc. And that larger network is very important. So in many classrooms you only have a couple of students who are interested in delinquency or doing it or who play truant. But if these kids meet all the others from all the other classrooms, then well, they are the relevant network. So sometimes you really have to include these out-of-class network information. There's also social network research on internalizing behavior. So people also select each other on the basis of anxiety, on depression, on loneliness. Lonely kids do not have a lot of friends, but if they have friends, it's very likely that they are as lonely as well. What also is important to realize is that yes, we can focus on who becomes friends with whom, but we can also use social network analysis to think about which friendships continue and which friendships are terminated. And then it turns out that, for example, that if you have relationships between adolescents who are non-depressed, so they are low on internalizing behavior, and they have friends that are high on internalizing behavior, that maybe they deselect those friends. So there's a lot of indication for that okay, some people are friends, but then at some moment they become dissimilar on this aspect of anxiety, depression, loneliness, and then maybe at some moment it becomes too much, and that they drop those relationships. And finally, there are also indications that there is also, for example, co-rumination going on, so that people influence each other in internalizing behaviors. Two other kinds of outcomes that I want to discuss in this part of my presentation, and one is substance use. And there's of course so much to say, so if you are really interested in this, read those articles. But one of the things that I want to point at here is that you can also use social network research to think about what would be a good timing for an intervention. And the state of the art is that peer influence in smoking occurs before the age of 15. So if you know that, then it's a waste of money and a waste of effort if the intervention starts after that period, because then some people are addicted and others are not. And So far I spoke about externalizing, internalizing substance use, so quite negative behaviors, but it's also good to realize that there are also studies that show that friends can also influence each other positively. So there are studies on academic achievement, on school engagement, on happiness, on help seeking, and there's also an article that is focused on this topic of, well, we should realize that friends are not always for the worse, they can also be for the better. Okay, that brings me to the avenues for further research. So, if you are start a new project, if you are thinking about what you can do with social network analysis, I hope that this can inspire you. So one of the things that is definitely worth considering is, well, what kind of influence are we talking about? Yes, we know that peers influence each other, but how does it work? Because if you look at the more experimental literature on peer influence, you will see that some say, well, peers influence each other because people imitate behavior, or others say, well, it's very often also peer pressure, or it is social norms. So there are all kinds of behavior. Sometimes the influence is unilateral, so one person is influencing the other, but there is also literature that's showing that influence can also be mutual, so that, well, people inspire each other, again for the good or the bad. So for the bad is, for example, deviancy training, so that, well, deviant kids, well, often communicate with each other, and if they do that, they very often try to, well, they are very often very competitive, and as a result, if one says, oh, last week I did this, the other one is bragging and saying, no, you did it, well, look at me, I did that. And it goes on and on and on, and it becomes, in that sense, quite negative spiral because they want to outperform each other. There is a study by the Finnish researcher Nona Kiuru, who already did more than 10 years ago a study in which he compared two ways to model influence in the Siena program. But unfortunately, it's one of the few studies that really looked at peer influence in that way, because it is a good question. Is there a reason to think that well, that there is, for example, contagion, so that people with, if you are friends with people who are relatively high on, for example, drinking, does that then also lead to an increase in your own drinking behavior? So just like a disease, is it the case that, well, that behavior spreads, and that people are contagious by others who are already doing it or already having it? The alternative may be that, well, yeah, people are affected upwards, but they can also be affected downwards. And the conclusion of this paper is, the title was, "Is depression contagious?" And as very often with titles with a question mark, the answer is no. So this study showed that there was much more evidence for convergence than for contagion. But that is something that has to be done more often. Something else is that with social network analysis, people often look at well, the frequency of behavior or a certain level of behavior and how that increases or decreases over time. But for some behaviors, it's good to realize that it's maybe more interesting whether some people started with the behavior, whereas others never started with that behavior. So the first use of marijuana, well, that is maybe the big difference. Or the first full drink, or the first heavy drinking episode, or your sexual debut. And there are studies on these topics, and for example, the onset to first alcohol use, a paper by John Light and others, showed that well, the first full drink was a very significant change. And the paper on sexual debut, published in Child Development, I forgot the name of the author, something like Tran, a difficult name, but showed that if you were exposed to others who already did it, then it was also more likely that you would have your sexual debut in the next period. Okay, so there are different ways to model influence. There are different things to look at. The beauty of behavior versus the frequency or the level. There are also different ways that people can influence each other. This was another contribution in the 2013 special issue, and by that time Matteo Gilletta, Mitch Prinstein and others came up with the brilliant idea that well, it may be the case that people influence each other on the same behavior. So if you are exposed to a lot of drinking behavior among your friends, then it's more likely that you will also drink more in the years to come. But it may also be the case that for some behaviors, it may be also other types of behaviors that may be influential or may create a kind of context in which certain behavior flourishes. And Matteo and Mitch looked at non-suicidal self-injury and found that if your friends cut themselves or did other types of non-suicidal self-injury, that behavior of your friends was by itself not influential, but they also examined whether their friends were depressed, and that was influential. And they also examined whether their friends were impulsive, and for boys that was influential as well. So a context in which your friends are super negative about themselves, and a context in which your friends are, the male friends are super impulsive, created a context that was more likely that you would do this non-suicidal self-injury. Something else that needs more exploration is the idea of bundles of behavior. If we look at the literature, then we see, well, people look at selection and influence for all kinds of outcomes, but maybe it's the case that there are bundles of behaviors. So in that paper they speak about, for example, the healthy group, and the healthy group is the group of non-smokers, non-drinkers, those who had never had sex. Probably they are quite young, otherwise I'm not so sure whether it's unhealthy, but they cannot be super young because there's also a question about the seatbelts. Anyway, the unhealthy group is then almost the opposite, so higher rates of substance use, didn't use a condom the last time they had sex, and were less physically active. And it turned out that if you looked at behaviors in this way, that people selected each other on lifestyles. So they do not have to resemble each other on all aspects, but it is a kind of lifestyle. And finally, if we think about types of influence, we also should learn much more on who's more susceptible or who's more influential. So, is it the case that some of your friends are more influential than others? And may that relate to that they are, for example, popular, or that you are closer to them? Despite that you call all of your friends friends, then some of them you may see more often. Or is it sometimes the case that people are more who are more influential are the friendships that you are not so sure about? So and that you do your very best to maintain these friendships, and for that reason that you adopt your behavior the most to those unstable or insecure relationships. And then who is more susceptible are the children and adolescents who are low on self-regulation. Are those the most susceptible? Well, we do not know the answers. There are some studies that have looked at it, but not so many. And if you are interested in this topic, I would start with this paper by Dawn DeLay and others. Okay, that brings me to the part on the types of complexity. I really think that one of the avenues for further research should be that we focus more on the role of social norms. I can imagine that you are very familiar with social norms. But in a nutshell, there are many different ways to define social norms. For example, very often people look at the descriptive norm, so the average behavior in a classroom. So if you think about, for example, research on drinking behavior, no, let's say bullying behavior, it's a better example. If you think about bullying behavior, well, then you can calculate the average of the classroom. And some classrooms are bad classrooms where a lot of bullying is going on, and others are much nicer and there's hardly any bullying. So the descriptive norm differs between these classrooms. You can also sometimes look at the prescriptive norm. That's not so super relevant now. If you want to read more about that, again, I pointed at a relevant paper. But what most studies using social network analysis have done so far is that they didn't look at the descriptive or the prescriptive norm, but that they looked at the popularity norm. And why is that? Because there's a lot of evidence that popular kids set the norm in a classroom. So it is not so relevant to know what everyone in the classroom is doing. No, you have to know what the popular kids in the classroom are doing. And there are different ways to assess these popularity norms, but again, if you want to know that, go to the paper that I just pointed at. But what did we then learn from these studies? Well, the first one was again in that special issue, so that was really a landmark special issue, the 2013 one. And Ashwin Rambaran and Jan Cornelis Dijkstra and Tobias Stark, they wrote a paper in which they showed that the influence of friends on adolescents' risk attitudes was the strongest in classrooms where risk attitudes were related to popularity. So, if the popular kids in the classroom were high on risk attitudes, others were more likely to become high on that over time. If the popular kids in the classroom were low on these risk attitudes, people were much less likely to become high on that. So, in that sense, social norms play a role. Someone else who did a lot of research on social norms is my former PhD student and postdoc, Lydia Laninga-Wijnen. And she did a fascinating study in which she showed that if popularity in a classroom is associated with prosociality, that you usually have a nice classroom. So others start to select each other on the basis of prosocial behavior, and sometimes there's also some influence. But if popularity is associated with aggression, you get a very bad classroom. But the problem is that in her study, about a quarter of the classes were nice classes based on prosociality. About a quarter of the classes were classes where popularity was associated with aggression. And that turned out in bad classes. But the problem was that the other half of the classes where aggression and prosocial behavior were both related to popularity. And the sad thing was that in these mixed classes, students mainly adopted the negative behavior. And that is something that we see more often with peer influence. Most of the negative behaviors are quite easily to adopt. So if I have to convince you that I'm a good drinker, it's super easy. We can go to the bar tonight and we can start to drink, and that's all I have to do. Super easy. But if I have to show you that I'm very prosocial, then I have to be super nice the whole week. And to everyone. So that is much harder. So for that reason, children and adolescents are often perceiving the popular kids as a kind of role models. And then they look at what these kids do, and then they copy, most of the times, the behaviors that are the most easy to copy. But that these popular kids very often have something extra, that is then something that they do not realize. And that is something that we have found with children and adolescents, but also with older students. But that makes it always complex for teachers, that very often a class can easily become a bad class because well, the signals are mixed, and people mainly pick up the negative signals. Well, I hope you start to realize that the aim of this talk is mainly to introduce you to social network analysis and all the possibilities with it. And I do that because I have the good hope that many of you will come up with great research in this area, and that you do not end with that basic question, is it selection or influence, but that you really think, well, for my topic it may be good to add something to it, and for that reason I give many of these options. So something that also is very inspirational is the work by Per Blok, and here is a paper he did with Thomas Grund, and they showed that individuals often seek social contact with others who are similar in some, but not per se in all ways. Well, this is maybe also a bit similar to what Jimmy Adams was talking about with bundles of behavior, but they looked at it from a perspective of a decreasing return to multiple similarity. So if you have certain behaviors, well, then some are super prominent, but the next one, if you are already similar on the first one, the next one is not so important anymore. And if you are already similar on two behaviors, well, the third one adds something, but not so much anymore. Per Blok argued for the same in another paper in which he looked at social settings. So if you already meet each other in one setting, well, that is ideal for a friendship. If you meet each other in two settings, well, there's a bigger chance. But if you meet each other in the third setting, well, the other two were already almost enough. So the third setting adds maybe something, but it's not super important anymore. And at some moment, there's no additional benefit of meeting each other more often. You have more than enough chances to become friends. Something else that is also very novel is a paper by Jacob Palacios, and that is about the idea whether people select each other on the basis of their own dietic perception of the behavior of someone else, or that they sometimes also base it on the reputation that people have. And Jacob found that people preferred friendships with people who had a prosocial reputation in general. So everyone in the classroom is seeing this person as prosocial, who were popular in general. But if it came down to their level of aggression, then it was the dietic perception that mattered. So some may have had an aggressive reputation, but as long as they were not perceived by these individuals themselves as being aggressive, and probably then towards them, as long as they didn't perceive themselves these others as aggressors, then it didn't matter that much. And most of the studies are really focused on peers, but it's also good to realize that now and then people also incorporate other influential actors like parents. Sometimes people also focus on actors at distance too. So the idea is that, okay, yes, you can be influenced by your friends, but maybe you are also influenced by the friends of your friends. And this paper is about drinking behavior, and the idea of this paper, which showed that the friends of your friends are relevant as well, is that the friends of your friends maybe provide information about new parties, or the friends of your friends are maybe kind of role models. So in that sense, the friends of your friends can be relevant as well. And in terms of complexity, the final topic to cover is that very often if we do social network analysis, we look at, for example, friendships. In the beginning I started with different networks questions, but most of the times it's about friendships as a relation, and then in relation to all kinds of behaviors or attitudes. But it is also possible to look at how network relationships influence each other, and here is a very nice paper by Gijs Huitzing from 2014, and one of the very first. And this paper looked at bullying and victimization, and then the question was, okay, here we have two victims, and they are both bullied by the same third person, and then the question is, what happened before? So it may be the case that these people were both victimized by the same bully, and at some moment they realized, well, we are in the same situation, maybe we should join forces. So that paper indeed found support for the idea of social support. It may also have been the case that in the beginning only this victim was bullied, and that this other person was the defender, and that at some moment the bully was irritated by all that defending behavior and started to retaliate. And there was also evidence for that. So here we really focus on dyadic relationships influencing each other over time. Well, the same holds also for if you have two bullies that bully the same victim. Well, maybe in the beginning they were just independently bullying the same person, but then over time they also became friends or defended each other. This paper was about defending, but there is another paper by Ashwin Rambaran who is really about friendships. But what also might have been the case that in the beginning only this person was bullying that, and the other was the defender or the friend of the bully, and that person also learned from the bully in which way you could easily bully that other person, and then over time there's also defending behavior starting to occur from that perspective. I can imagine that this goes quite rapidly, but the 2014 paper is definitely a must read. Okay, that brings me to the last part, and I will go through that quite briefly, although it's very relevant, I think, because I see myself as a social network researcher, and I've done also some intervention work, but never with peer-led interventions. And a couple of years ago, I wrote a current opinion paper together with Lilia Langenwijnen, and in that paper we tried to bring those two fields together, and we concluded that there's much more research needed on theories of peer influence, and that type of research may also be good to maximize the impact of these peer-led interventions. So what is the idea of peer-led interventions? So very often with adolescents, there are interventions that used to be given by teachers, but then at some moment people come up with the idea, would it work better if we ask peers to do these lessons? So you train a part of the peer group, and the hope is that the information then diffuses to the others. And sometimes it's you only train them and they adapt their behavior and others copy that. Sometimes it is the case that they really have to give lessons. And the hope is then that if other teenagers give the lessons that or are the role models, that people are more likely to internalize that new norms occur, that they do it with appropriate language, and that peers like it better. But there are also, of course, some potential disadvantages. So how can you be sure that these people are capable to provide the intervention? So there may be variable quality of the skills that they have, and an even bigger risk, it may also be the case that they spread unwanted messages. Well, I'm in the middle of doing a systematic review, and although this talk is mainly about social network analysis, this is a small take-home message that I also would like to give. There's nowadays very brilliant software, AI software, that you can use if you do a systematic review. And what it mainly does is that we had selected 1,500 studies, and normally you would have to go through all the abstracts and titles of these studies to make a decision whether you want to read the full paper. But with the AI, we could train the program, and as a result, what we did was, in the beginning, we already knew that about 8 studies had to be included. So that was an advantage. But even if you don't have that, the program learns all the time from the selections that you make. And as soon as you already have selected some and not selected others, the program starts to reshuffle the pile of papers that you still have to go through, and puts the ones that are most similar to the ones you already have selected on top. And then the idea is that if you go through about a third of all the papers, and you do not have a hit for the last 10%, so in our case no hits for the last 160, then you can stop. So the idea is that, so what this brought us is that in the end we screened 600 papers, and we didn't have to screen the other almost 1,000 papers, because it was super unlikely that the other thousands would be relevant, because they are so different from the ones that were selected by us, and they were much more similar to the ones we didn't select. So it is ideal, and of course you can have your doubts. Well, is really are you really able to use it? Well, the good news is this software has been used already a lot, and many publications already use it. So it's definitely possible. And the last thing that I want to say about it, it saves you time. I'm also convinced that you become more precise, because if you have to screen more than 1,500 articles, it's such dull work. But here, it's super exciting, because in the beginning, all the articles are very relevant, because all the time they are pretty close to what you are looking for, and sometimes you do not want to select it, but still you have to think about it. So in the beginning it's super nice, and then at some moment you start to realize, oh, okay, now I'm in the area where nothing is relevant. What are all these peer-led interventions that we selected are about? Well, anti-bullying, anti-conflict, e-cigarette use, obesity, sexual health, smoking, substance use, suicide, prevention, of course. And all these interventions have indeed diffusion as the driving mechanism, and the idea is that peer leaders facilitate through intervention sessions or through their behavior as a role model, that they influence the outcomes for the others, and usually it's done with peers in the same grade. There's one study that did it with kids one grade below, but I'm thinking whether I should exclude that study, because I'm much more interested in what's happening in the same grade. And as I said, these fields of social network research on selection influence and these social network interventions are almost two complete different fields. Tom Valenti is one of the few that really is in both fields. But these studies base their selection of who should they target as the peer leaders really on social network questions. So here you see the whole list. So for example, who are good leaders, but also who do you look up to, or whose opinion do you trust, or who's good in persuading others. So there are all kinds of examples of questions that people have used to select the leaders. There are also some other ways to select. So one study did it by school staff, but most of the times it's based on peer nominations. And very often these studies try to assign at least 15% of the target group. So there's an idea of that 15% should be the critical mass. And there's also evidence that training more leaders leads to increased exposure. Well, what about the outcomes of these interventions? Well, the odds of being a smoker was much smaller than 1 in the ASSIST study. So that study, well, intervened in smoking behavior. The sources of strength, the suicidal prevention program, had good results for example, the willingness to seek help. So far the good news, but there are also many studies that have negative outcomes. So these peer-led interventions are expensive. You may think it's not so expensive if peers do it, but please realize you have to train them, and quite extensively. So many of these programs had half a week training hours for the adolescents. And it may also lead to adverse effects. So teenagers are quite unpredictable, so they do not always tell exactly what you do, and also think of what you're doing. If you have an anti-smoking intervention and the one that gives the training is saying you should not smoke, but everyone knows that he is always smoking, so, and still does. So that, in that sense, how believable are some of the teenagers? Some programs also found effects on, well, very often the peer leaders were also quite popular, but some also found effects on their popularity, that they dropped a bit as a result of the intervention. Is that what you want? That's an ethical issue. And in the end, some of the programs also realized that, well, the kind of information that we want to spread through the peers is sometimes too complex. Okay, I think I've spoken mainly about 5 topics, and I hope that you at least will remember that the field has expanded in recent decades and that it's still possible to jump on this train. That there's a high need for research in other parts of the world than only North America and Europe. And look at my slides about the types of influence, of the types of complexity. And if you are doing intervention work, also think about how we can integrate those 2 fields. And that is, these 3 topics are also the topics that I will focus on in the next years. But if you want to discuss with me, well, the kind of research that you want to do on these topics, you're more than welcome to discuss that in the next week with me. Thank you. So the question was about what is the ideal interval between measurement waves. And yeah, that is of course a very difficult question because it depends on the kind of behavior that you want to study. I love the work of Christoph Stadtveld. I love the work of Per Blok. Per Blok was also doing a study together with a neuroscientist from the UK in which they followed the group on an Arctic expedition. So this group of teenagers, 20 I think, were followed during 10 days that they were on an Arctic expedition. And every day they collected data. And in that study, for example, they looked at the pain that these people had, and whether if you were exposed to friends who were already suffering during this expedition, that it was more likely that you would start to suffer as well. If that is the kind of setting in which you collect your data, then I can imagine that daily data are super interesting. But for other aspects, maybe 6 months is good enough, because friendships do not change on a daily basis, and behavior doesn't change as well. So it really depends on your question. And yeah, the only thing I can say is if it is more than 12 months, then at some moment the interval becomes too long. You have no idea what happens in between. Yeah, so the question is about lies, and I assume that you asked me the question, how can we be sure that these teenagers provide you the correct information about their behavior and also about their relationship? But the good thing is then, of course, that the way we model social networks is from a unilateral perspective. And if I say that Jago is my friend, but Jago doesn't reciprocate that nomination, then I still may be influenced by him, because from my perspective I'm friends with him. So it may be true that some people have a misperception of their friendships, but they may also be influenced by their misperception. So in that sense, what we have learned over the years is that stable relationships are not per se more influential than the unilateral relationships. And people are very often influenced by the ones that they want to be friends with, or hope that the other is also reciprocating. It was the last question there. So the question is was about popularity and what makes someone popular, and it's good that you asked that question because here it's important to clarify that social network researchers refer to popularity in terms of the number of nominations that you receive. But researchers in the area of childhood and adolescence, so developmental researchers, make a distinction between likability and popularity. And likability is much more what social network researchers think of. So who are the ones that receive a lot of friendships? Whereas developmental researchers nowadays realize that likability is not the same as popularity. Popularity is more that you are cool, that others perceive you as popular, that others want to hang out with you. And those kids very often show negative behavior. At least that is part of their repertoire. And that's also what I showed in that very nice study in which we found that in only 25% of the classes popularity is only associated with prosocial behavior, whereas in 75% of the classes it is only related with negative behavior or partly related with negative behavior. So very often popular kids are the ones that are aggressive, not per se super aggressive, but at least delinquent, are the ones that start early with drinking, things like that. So that are early with the sexual debut, so they are cool. Yeah. Okay, thank you.